Welcome to our webinar, Pathways to Renewables. I'm Ryan Frompazuli, Staff Assistant for the Institute for Energy Law, which is an institute of the Center for American and International Law. Today's program is co-hosted by the Renewables Practice Committee and by the Law School Outreach Subcommittee of IEL's Young Energy Professionals Practice Committee. This webinar is part of a four-part series of webinars designed for summer associates. And today, our moderator is Christopher Watts. He is a senior associate at Mayer Brown in their Houston office, and he is a member of the Litigation and Dispute Resolution Practice. Christopher's practice focuses on civil litigation in state and federal courts, as well as arbitration, and I will now pass it over to Christopher to introduce the rest of the panelists.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning. One of the benefits of being summer associates is you do not have to maintain your license and take CLEs, so we get to make this as fun and interesting as we can. I'm going to echo what Ryan just said and really encourage you all to at least put one question into the Q&A as we have this conversation. It's going to be super informal and casual. We have some really awesome practitioners in the renewable space who will introduce themselves in a moment, but the more you interact, the more you'll get out of it. That's kind of the life lesson in law anyway. As Ryan said, I am a senior associate litigator in the Houston office of Mayer Brown. I am ancient and I've been practicing for a really long time, but for today, I get to just ask questions and listen and learn from this awesome panel of practitioners who are scattered all over the place. So with that, I'm just going to pass the mic. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their backgrounds, what they do for a living now, kind of a little bit about how they got here, and then we'll start with some very general topics and we'll get into some conversations. So please remember to put your questions in the Q&A, and I promise to ask them anonymously. So I have first on my list here is Matt.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Matt Giles. I currently work as in-house counsel for Chevron, specifically Chevron's Renewable Fuels Division, Chevron Renewable Energy Group. I've been practicing in the renewable space for a little over a decade, specifically in biodiesel and renewable diesel, but since recently expanding into other renewable fuels, including sustainable aviation fuel, ethanol, and others. The way I got into practice is, if I go back a little bit, even before becoming a lawyer, I'd always pursued, I guess, passion interests and had worked in economic development in Latin America. I was a teacher for a couple of years in the Bronx. And then after law school, wanted to continue to pursue the practice of law in an area that I felt passionate about. And that led me into renewable fuels, where I currently practice. Partly, the company that I joined was a publicly traded biodiesel company, and we were acquired by Chevron about 2 years ago, and I'm happily practicing with Chevron now. So look forward to discussing with the group.
Thanks, Matt. And then Jenae.
Thank you, Chris. Good to be here. My name is Jenae Allert, and I'm out of Oklahoma City. I started my practice working in-house. I've been working in the energy sector for just over 15 years now. The majority of my practice and experience is with land acquisition, so helping operators, the energy operators, secure their footprint of land essentially through leases or other acquisitions. And working that in-house portion of my career was really useful and vital to being surrounded essentially by the experts, the people with the ideas, your technical group who have that idea and that vision. And so my role for the majority of my career has been, how do I enable that operator to realize that vision and that goal of what project that they're trying, to successfully build out and then operate. So I view my practice as a problem solver and a facilitator for operators realizing their vision in their projects.
So, and then Irina.
Hi, everyone. Really great to be here, and I'm excited for our conversation today. So my name is Irina Tsveklova. I am a partner in the Houston office of Weil, Gotshal, Manges LLP in the private equity group. My background sort of starts from originally from Russia, grew up in Scotland, and then I went to law school in Scotland. Outside of US, you go to law school as an undergrad, so all I've ever done was law and didn't kind of focus on anything else in my undergrad. But in any event, and then I went to UT and I got an LLM, and I was always passionate about energy, just more so because of my Russian background. So you would think traditional, kind of more oil and gas stuff. But as I started practicing in the projects group, I realized that I was kind of more interested, or had more exciting and interesting deals in my mind that were focused on solar, wind. And so my practice in the last decade has sort of developed into two aspects: project development. So that's, kind of building, kind of thinking about building, financing, structuring an energy project, buying key equipment, supply, construction, operation and maintenance, and importantly, whenever you do build an energy facility, really focusing on the cash flow, the securing the offtake agreement, which basically kind of funds the building of the project in the first place. And the second aspect of my practice is around M&A, buying and selling like energy assets or company platforms that are developing many different energy assets. And over the years, it's while it's kind of started more traditional, I would say for the last 8 to 9 years, I've focused more so on solar, wind, battery storage, and sort of what we're going to talk about today, which is a broader umbrella of renewables like renewable natural gas, biofuels, hydrogen, and other aspects of renewable energy. So really excited to chat with you guys today.
Wonderful. And Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lee, Deputy General Counsel at Electric Hydrogen. We manufacture, deliver, and commission the world's most powerful electrolyzers for critical industry to produce the lowest cost of green hydrogen. But going back 6 years ago, that was really my introduction into the renewable energy industry. I didn't start out in energy at all. I actually started out right out of law school in the telecom infrastructure industry in Houston as an in-house real estate attorney. Spent about 5 years there in various roles. Then I was recruited through the power of LinkedIn to join a large wind and solar developer here in Houston as their in-house real estate attorney, drafting site control agreements to support their project development team for both wind and solar projects all across the United States. That was my introduction to renewable energy, and I loved it. Then I spent about 5 years at a leading US solar panel manufacturer, where at the time when I joined, they had a project development team, and I joined to support both real estate and permitting. And during my time there, I then expanded out into becoming more of a generalist into corporate and commercial law. And here at Electric Hydrogen now, I support procurement, sales, and among other things. So just based on like my experience, there's so much in renewable energy, and it's quickly growing. And there's just so much that as as attorney practitioners that we can do with our skills.
Wonderful. So you might imagine that we've met before this panel, but I'm going to shake things up just a little bit, not too much, panelists. So don't be frightened just yet. But each of you said something really interesting that I'd like to follow up on in your practices. So Matt, going back to you, you said part of what you work on is sustainable aviation fuel. That is the first time I have ever heard that phrase. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's going on there?
Yeah, so sustainable aviation fuel, if you think about the oil and gas sector has traditionally produced a number of different products, fuel products, and all kinds of different products. But within fuel, you think about gas, and you think about diesel, and you think about jet fuel. Each one of those has alternatives that can be produced from biomass sources. So think plants or animals as opposed to things that you extract from the ground. And sustainable aviation fuel is the name that I guess has taken hold for the jet fuel alternative that can be produced from plants and animals. And we can go into more than that, but I think at a high level, that probably gives you an idea of what it is.
And just one follow-up there, is there a large market share in aviation fuel that's sustainable, or is that still?
No, it's an emerging market, but one of the things about fuel policy, and I would dare say renewables in general, is that they're often highly supported by policy and policy enabled. And so there's a lot of focus recently in enabling policies to reduce emissions with aviation. So aviation is considered a hard to abate sector. The emissions are difficult to abate. And so there's a lot of focus now on how do we abate that, and sustainable aviation fuel has been identified as a technology that is viable and just needs to be expanded. But the market share is pretty small right now.
Interesting. Okay, and Jenae, you mentioned that land acquisition, excuse me, is plays a big role in your practice, and often people don't think about how important land itself is in the renewable space. So can you just chat a little bit about, why that's critical, specifically when we're talking about renewable energy?
Sure. It comes into play a lot, and you'll see just kind of, there's so many different presentations as you go to your different CLEs right now about co-location of different energy assets, so sharing the surface. So coming from a largely oil and gas background and then transitioning into renewables, a lot of my background has been negotiating, helping these developers negotiate their surface use agreements. And so what is that footprint on the surface, as you are generating and producing energy? And depending on what state you're in, so if it is a historical, producing oil and gas producing state, and you're, walking in, it used to be, coal was sharing the surface with oil and gas, and now, your wind and your solar farms are sharing the surface with oil and gas. And so it's about, how do I fit, my planned development into what's already happening on the surface? And so it goes not only to negotiating, with the surface owner, negotiating those land contracts for your renewables client to operate on that surface, but then also navigating, the regulatory, the setbacks, the permitting infrastructure, any sort of, protected use that's already out there. So it's kind of fitting your puzzle piece of what your client wants to do into, the whole of the puzzle that's already there.
So we can't just go put a solar farm anywhere we want to and just kind of plant the flag. There's some stuff we have to go through to get there.
Yeah, there's a couple steps, a couple hoops, but yeah.
And I think to Jenae's point, one of the things is you could have fatal flaws, right? And again, I'm not an oil and gas expert, but I understand maybe if you're missing a mineral rights here and there, you could approach the owner, get it, or kind of adjust the drilling. But if you've kind of planned your wind farm and there's a problem, and you can't just easily move a wind turbine from one spot to another. Right. So I think that it's also there could be, to Jenae's point, on the surface, a lot more issues that are harder to cure.
Definitely.
And so, Irina, you mentioned that you work in the private equity space, which is a pretty popular term in the legal world. Can you just explain a little bit to the Summers who might not know what private equity is, and then how private equity is involved in renewable energy just as its own industry?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And so my background is not exclusively just in the private equity space, but that's kind of where I'm sitting at the moment. So when we say private equity, we're thinking about funds, large, small funds like Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or Brookfield or Blackstone, who are investing across various types of businesses, and who first of all look at energy as one of the industries that they're interested in investing in, and then we would help them sort of evaluate opportunities that they're interested in investing in, or to the extent that they already own various renewable assets and they're selling them, they're exiting, we would be helping them on kind of like the M&A and the corporate front. So that's sort of bigger picture, and then I would say as there's just sort of a general goal towards moving towards sustainability and what we call energy transition, which is just sort of gradually moving from kind of away from fossil fuels in terms of production and consumption towards either low carbon or renewable sources. These kind of big private equity funds are also feeling the pressure from their limited partners, kind of entities that are investing in them, to also try and focus more on investing in sustainable, low carbon platforms. And so we're sort of helping them with those strategies as well.
Awesome. I'm going to encourage our Summers, for those of them who have joined us, to throw some questions in the Q&A, just in case you're interested. Jennifer, you mentioned green hydrogen. And so can you just tell, when is hydrogen not green? I'm assuming it's not the color. And then, what kind of goes into that? What is that process if there's a company that's focused on green hydrogen?
Yeah, it was really interesting. I was actually at a recent CLE where I heard Irina describe it as the rainbow of hydrogen. Like, there's just so many different colors, and I just love that reference. But green hydrogen specifically is when you use a renewable energy source to power the electrolyzer to convert water and isolate like the hydrogen molecule from like H2O. And I'm not a chemist, so I'm learning a lot about just the technology behind specifically electrolyzers, because that's the company that, like, that's what we do. But with this big push with energy transition and green hydrogen, back to a point that Matt had made earlier about sustainable aviation, I know that's one of the industries that are exploring that, like the chemical ammonia. There's very energy intensive that are like considered like the dirtier industries, where there's like a lot of mining that uses a lot of hydrogen. So with this push to the energy transition or greener sources, there's a lot of emphasis on green hydrogen to quickly accelerate like decarbonization. And you're going to hear a lot of these different terms, especially in the hydrogen industry, about like decarbonizing, or like how quickly can we decarbonize to like hit our various initiatives to get like hit net zero by whatever year.
Fascinating. So we've gotten a little bit into the weeds, but I'm going to ask a very general question. I'm going to pose it to Irina, if I may, but 10,000, and the other panelists, please jump in with other opinions, but 10,000-foot view, when we talk about renewable energy, what are we talking about generally?
Yep, thank you. And no pressure. I just wrote a few bullet points, and everybody else, please chime in. Yeah, so when we're talking about renewable energy, we're really talking about naturally replenishing resources. So most people, when they hear renewables, they kind of think, okay, solar, wind, battery storage, or they might think, okay, hydropower or hydroelectric, that's the umbrella. But the umbrella of renewables is in fact much bigger. And as we talk about energy transition or decarbonization, to what Jennifer was saying, again, we're talking about gradually, not kind of immediately, but moving away from heavily relying on fossil fuels to produce energy and in our consumption to kind of renewable or low carbon energy. We need to think about a much bigger kind of portfolio of what is, what is renewables. So when you think about renewables, you should also think about renewable natural gas, so sort of using animal waste or landfill waste to produce basically a natural gas equivalent. Biofuels, hydrogen, to what Jennifer was saying, as long as it's made from renewable sources, geothermal energy, critical minerals. There's just a big umbrella that, when one thinks about renewable energy, and you might say, why is this important? Why are we talking about renewable energy? Well, generally with the energy transition, and renewable energy is a big part of that, we're talking about kind of giving everyone access to affordable, reliable, sustainable power. And, as populations continue to grow, generally power demand is only going to rise, and globally, domestically. And three things you should think about in terms of, this power demand surge, and that's, AI revolution. So, generative AI requires a lot of power, and there's estimates out there that basically in the next 3 years, the kind of demand for power from AI, from generative AI in particular, will be like growing by 70% each year. Data centers in general, crypto mining, all of that requires electricity. So where's that power going to come from? There's a push to electrify the economy. So we're thinking like electric vehicles, manufacturing, kind of other sectors where there's a push to electrify them. Where's that power? Where's the electricity coming from? And generally, the third aspect is focusing on sustainability and addressing climate change. So when you're factoring all of this power demand, and you're starting to think, okay, but how are we going to slowly shift away from fossil fuels and yet meet all of this demand? And this is where you're having to think kind of beyond just wind and solar and battery storage, and expand that renewable umbrella to whether it's biofuels, RNG, hydrogen, other not necessarily new, but technologies that are now getting a lot of, like Matt said, policy support through tax incentives, through just general favorable policy. And then the last thing I'll just say is, even if you don't end up focusing on energy in your career, I think one way or another, it will be around you, just because, every company, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's Coca-Cola, whether it's Nike, they're setting sustainable goals. And a big part of that is how they're powering their operations. And so you will, sustainability is something you'll hear a lot of people talk about as you walk through your career. I don't know, that was a lot. I know Matt and Jenae and Jennifer, you have something to add.
I think you made a really great point there. Like, even if you don't directly practice in renewable energy, most likely you're going to support clients who are sourcing power and buying power from renewable energy sources through like PPA. So it is something where the more knowledge and information you gather, like, the better. And I think I just take that approach in general with like my entire legal career of like having that learning mindset and just being curious. And even if that's not something you're practicing now, if you're interested, learn as much as you can about it and connect with the folks. I know for myself, like green hydrogen, even before I joined my current company, when I heard about green hydrogen several years ago, it became like really interesting to me. So I try to read and learn as much about this industry as possible.
Wonderful. Matt or Jenae, anything to add? You don't have to, no pressure.
Yeah, I would piggyback off of that as far as just, you're gonna have successful client relationships if, you care about what they care about and you're interested in what they're interested in. And so I think with renewables specifically, energy generally, you can be very passionate about it, and that's going to show in your work, and it's going to show in the way that you kind of mirror back and mimic back the concerns and really understand what your client is trying to achieve. And then you're able to put yourself, inside of that, kind of solution making process, and just really, mediate and alleviate and help them, along the path of their goal that I would have there.
Yeah, Chris, maybe taking it a little bit further as far as scope of what are renewables. I think Irina outlined it really well, that it's quite broad. But as summer associates and thinking about your future practice, you may not end up directly in a traditional renewables practice. But if you're in the commercial space, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to have to be familiar with renewables in general. You will likely work in industries or businesses that consume utilities, that have mobility, that work with infrastructure, and becoming familiar with the policies that enable financial transactions and what are encouraged. Certainly, if you're working in any sort of international focused practice, it's a high level of international cooperation or discussion, or sometimes non-cooperation internationally. But it's good to be familiar with how broad it is and how it affects different businesses. And one thing that I noticed a question came up in the Q&A, and maybe this will help. So I didn't say, but I practice in Ames, Iowa. And it's not traditionally thought of as an energy hub. And until recently, when wind became more popular, it wasn't considered much of a renewable hub. But this is where we can get what the raw materials for our product. And so as far as renewables is very broad, which means the locations that you can practice also is very broad, I guess, to make the answer short.
And so perfect segue into our first question, which we appreciate from anonymous attendee number 3618. The question is, as an energy law attorney, how important is the city that you practice in? Which is a great question. I think we're all, except for Irina and I, who are literally in the same building, in somewhere different. So curiously, Matt just described where he was, but Jenae, Irina, Jennifer, you want to describe a little bit about your location and how that might influence your practice?
Sure. I can kind of speak to more so about where my career has taken me. So I grew up, my dad was a petroleum engineer, and he worked in probably like 5 different countries by the time I was like 12. But that's kind of like your historic way of thinking, or if you're a technical person, you have to actually be on the ground at the project, right? For myself, then I've gone to 5 different states, just depending on where the operator was and where my projects were. So there was a time for about 2 years that my commute, if you will, was me getting on a plane every Monday morning and flying from Oklahoma City to Denver, spending the couple of days in Denver, and then I'd fly from there to Pittsburgh, spend a couple of days in Pittsburgh, and then on Friday, my commute home was back to Oklahoma City. So there I was doing a flight. I did that for a year. I was on a flight every single week for a year. That was when I was younger, didn't have a family yet. And so it was basically just, like Matt said, wherever your project is and wherever your clients are, that's kind of where it's going to go. As far as, obviously all of the, online footprint that we have now, and your ability to connect to people, statewide, countrywide, internationally, then I would say, as the early part of your career, you're going to want to be where, the action is, because that's where you are going to make those meaningful relationships, and you are going to build kind of that foundation of your network, and you're going to learn so much more being in the same room, with everybody, especially the technical folks, like I said before. And then now, once you do have that foundation and the basis, then I think your career kind of transitions into what is your, personal responsibilities and obligations. What does that look like as far as where you're going to, kind of put your roots down? Not to say that you're not going to be, traveling still, but I think the question, where does it matter that you live? I think it changes as you progress through your career.
Jennifer, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that in the early parts of your career, it's useful and helpful to be what Jenae said, like in the city where the action, or to build the relationships with the folks you want to learn from. But I do see this shift, like after the pandemic, especially access to Zoom, Teams, where I've seen really a strong collaboration between like different offices. So if you're an associate in a different office, but like the partner that you work with is in a whole different office, I've seen that work. It just depends on like the style of the individuals. From an in-house attorney perspective, I don't say that it matters like too much, but back to the relationship piece. I'm remote, but I'm traveling once a month to the offices where the majority of my business stakeholders are, to develop the relationships and to like learn, because I do think that it fosters like stronger like relationship development. But at my last company where I was for 5 years, the majority of the legal team, we were like remote. We were scattered like all across the country, and our collaboration with our business clients, it was seamless. So I don't think that it particularly matters like from an in-house perspective. I've seen but then again, it depends on like what company you're joining, because some companies do still have a very strong like in-office culture. So you just really need to understand like the culture of that company or firm.
Wonderful. Yeah, please
I
go
would
ahead.
thank you. I would just quickly add, I think that I completely agree with both Jenae and Jennifer about those initial informative years. Frankly, whether it's a law firm or whether you're in-house, I do think being as close as you can to the mothership is kind of the best way to be, frankly, at least for the first initial years, or making sure that kind of like the partners, if it's a law firm that you'll be working with, are there, or you have like readily access to them in those initial years. And my renewables practice actually was mostly out of New York and San Francisco before I came back to Houston. And I would just say bigger picture, like if you're going to do corporate M&A or finance or IP, within the energy industry, it doesn't really matter where you are, as long as you're kind of like in one of the bigger cities. I think if you're going to do something like regulatory work, maybe some environmental work, that there could be a benefit in being in DC, for example. And I think that's where I would say like most of our practitioners that do that kind of work end up there. But if you're just thinking kind of like general corporate transactional work, then I don't think it matters as much.
And I'm a litigator. Matt, please add. Go right ahead.
I'm playing off of what we've talked about. I think we've talked about this being pathways to renewables, and I think this just raises an important question about, well, how do you get into it in the first place? And if I go back to when I was a law student, I think I had a really narrow view of what was possible. And I thought of on-campus recruiting, and you go and you do your summer at a law firm. And then, beyond that, I didn't really know what came next. And so I guess what I would say is that's only one path. There are multiple paths into renewables, but going to a large law firm is a great path. And but it's not the only one. And for going in-house, especially, I would say in renewables, these are competitive positions. A lot of people feel passionately about this, and there are a lot of people that want to do it. And so if you go into a big law firm, or if you go into a small law firm, or if you go into a litigation practice, or if you do public service, government work, you need to be deliberate about pursuing a path in renewables. There are going to be a lot of people competing. And so it just, if it's something that you want to do, you need to build those relationships. And I think that's why the panel's been talking a lot about where you are matters. And that might matter where you live, but it also matters what industry events you attend, who you socialize with, what industry groups and CLEs you attend, and the relationships that you build. Going in-house is not easy. And so getting your foot in the door is a big deal, and you have to be deliberate about it. And so the bottom line is a lot of pathways to renewables. But one thing that I would say across the board is, because it's interesting and competitive, you have to be an excellent lawyer. And so don't negate the practice of law. If you're a litigator, you be an excellent litigator, and that'll increase your likelihood of landing a job in renewables. If you're a commercial transactional lawyer, be excellent at that. And that'll help land a job. You never know what relationship is going to lead you where you want to go in renewables.
I think that is so spot on, Matt, because the renewable energy industry, myself being in it for 6 years, I've negotiated across the table from so many attorneys that you see over and over again, and they've moved firms, or in-house attorneys move firms. Business folks especially move a lot, especially with the growth of many different developers. So the relationships that you foster are so important. Like, you don't know where your next opportunity will come from. But back to Matt's point about getting into the renewable energy industry, I will say from an in-house perspective, the commercial folks, it's a very mission-driven industry. So you're going to work with some of the most passionate people about that particular either technology or development project that they're doing. So you equally need to mirror that passion, and but also in your early years, get really excellent at your skill set, the technical skills, build that foundation, but also work on those relationships as well.
All excellent points. We have a second question that has come in. Thank you very much to our next anonymous attendee. And I would just add to that, as a litigator, that I sit in Houston. I'm also from Houston. And fun fact about Houston, only New York City has more Fortune 500 companies headquartered in it than Houston. And that is almost exclusively because of large energy companies. And a lot of my practice is for large energy companies. Sometimes in the renewable space, but one of my largest matters is for a large energy company on an ERISA matter. So you just kind of never know where your path is going to take you. And as a law student, you should just let it take you where it takes you, and you'll be full circle. You never know. Okay, question number 2. Do you foresee any big changes in regulations surrounding renewables that will affect your day-to-day work generally? Awesome question. I'm also going to expand that to the panel to also discuss any additional potential challenges you might see in your space. And I will offer that on the cyber front, which is part of my practice, there is a very big push from government for what I would just call general reporting requirements for cyber incidents for critical infrastructure. So think anything that comes out of the ground, basically. And that has caused my clients to raise flags where they need to, in order to make sure that we stay on top of an issue that people don't often think about with energy, which is cyber related issues. So putting that back to the panel, whoever might want to go first on changes that you foresee or any regulations that will change your day-to-day work.
I'm happy to
Irina,
go first.
please.
I will just, I mean, I think there could be a lot, so I'll mention two things. One of the important things, and this kind of alludes to what Matt mentioned at the beginning, policy, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, that was passed a couple of years ago, provides very significant financial incentives for renewables and just generally low carbon energy products. And so we are in the process now of getting key guidance from the IRS and Department of Treasury on some of the aspects of the IRA, for example, green hydrogen, that Jennifer is working on. And so, you know, depending on how those regulations, how the guidance comes out, you may see more of certain kind of projects or less, or you may see developers refocus on instead of green hydrogen, blue hydrogen. I won't go into the rainbow, and it's not exactly an easy switch, but I would say that the Inflation Reduction Act is a key key piece of legislation where there could be changes depending on the election and sort of where, so there might be changes on the policy front there. We think that generally unlikely that there would be, unlikely that an IRA would be repealed, for example, because it's just such a huge, legislative act, and it actually benefits a lot of, not just when you think about sort of renewables, you might think about blue states, but it benefits a lot of red states because of where manufacturing is located. And in fact, like Texas is the #1 solar state, it's the #1 wind state. There are plenty of other states that are red and have, significant amount of renewable energy. So I think kind of elections, and as a result, this year, the various guidance pieces that we're still waiting on various aspects of their IRA, that could impact the kind of projects that we see day to day. And then something that I don't do, but I know that's being, you guys maybe at law school are discussing a lot more about it, is the emission disclosures, for under SEC rules and for kind of just generally big companies disclosing, level 1, level 2, level 3, or scope 1, I think it's called, scope 1 through 3 emissions. So I think those things will absolutely impact our corporate, public corporate kind of practice in the energy field.
Wonderful. Jenae, you turn your mic on.
Sure, I can talk through some of this as well, and it's more on a state level. And so, yes, everything is changing right now, top to bottom, in each of these states as they are wanting to, invite and attract the, renewables operators in order to make their state, available and hit the requirements so that the, IRA funds, can now flow to there on a statewide basis, because yeah, that does attract a huge amount of jobs, a lot of infrastructure to be built, and just, adding to, the huge amount of network that is going to need to be built as far as transmission lines all the way across the nation in order to meet the demands of this huge amount of influx of energy that is going to be produced and consumed as you walk into, 2030, 2050. It just goes exponential as far as what that usage and that consumption need looks like. As far as just on a statewide basis, it depends what is the current legal landscape of the state that you're talking about. So if you do, walk into what has been, historically oil and gas producing state, and, now they're trying to shift into more of a renewables, friendly landscape, then, just like any other regulation, it's going to depend on, what lobbyists are there and whose interests are, going to be, protected and furthered along that state legislature. Even in Oklahoma, obviously a very historical oil and gas producing state, our legislature is very excited about renewables coming in, and they are, speeding along to try to change up some of their legislation so that we can get more of the solar developers. We already have a lot of wind here. When you look at, the Appalachia Basin, so historically, coal producing states, well, now oil and gas producing states, when you're looking at Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, they're also very incentivized to bring, a lot of the renewables in as well. And so it affects everybody as far as what your permitting process looks like, what's already there, current use on the land, but then also how do all of the different ownership, kind of tiers work together. So your surface owner versus your mineral owner versus your coal owner. Everything is everything's on the table as far as what is being thought about on a regulatory, level. So yeah, the question or the answer is everything. Everything is changing as far as regulations go.
Yeah, I think Jenae highlights well just how much laws and regulations affect practice in renewables. And that's at the local, at the state, at the national, and international level. There are policies related to renewables all across. And so we spend a lot of time monitoring the law and responding to developments in the law. If you're looking for an exciting area to practice in, this is it. It's ever changing. One of the challenges is that as new regulations are implemented, nobody really knows what to do with them. You can't go to a lawyer that's been practicing for 20 years and say, hey, how do I solve this problem? Because they've never seen it before. And there are analogies that you can use in your practice, but you'll be answering a lot of novel questions. And so there are some gray areas. One of the things that we see with policy is that policies are often enacted with certain goals. And we talk about the technology gap between the current state of technology and the ultimate policy goal. And, those regulations are interesting and exciting, but the technology has to develop. And so it requires a lot of innovation in those spaces. And sometimes working with lawmakers and regulators to help them understand what the current state is and what is truly possible, regardless of what's in the regulation. Anyway, I think another area to keep in mind is that one of the challenges is that sometimes you can have regulations and policies that don't work well together. And so you'll figure out a solution in Ohio that doesn't work in Indiana. Or you'll have a policy and you'll build a whole system around how to do it in California, but you're bringing in technology from Singapore or Korea, and that was designed under different regulations. And so navigating that is challenging and really important as a renewables practitioner.
Jennifer, anything to add? I have plenty of questions to pepper you all with in the 11 minutes that we have left.
No, to the question about if I foresee any changes and regulations that would impact my day-to-day, I'm placing my chip on there's going to be the 45V credit, which impacts green hydrogen specifically, is going to be favorable. And hopefully like an uptick in work, which would impact sales of our product. That's what I foresee, hopefully. But regardless, I think it's a very innovative area. It's exciting because of the points mentioned that there is no precedent. Like you can retool concepts or ideas that you've seen in other industries to try to fit it for this new area. But regardless of how the regulations shake out, I think it's a really exciting area where you can use a lot of creativity.
Awesome. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. If you have any questions you really wanted to shoot off, please do so. In the meantime, I would like to know from the panel. So we have a group of law students. they've all stayed on, which means they're at least pretending to be interested. So, what are some either really cool projects that you all are working on or have worked on, or some interesting war stories, or just something to kind of show, what we do, kind of soup to nuts on one of these types of projects or deals or cases?
I could open up with a really interesting project that I worked with Irina on. It's been a half a decade for palm sludge oil out of Indonesia, but I'll avoid that because it may bring some nightmares to both of us. But just thinking of, I mentioned I practice in biofuels, and we take waste products, and I failed to mention this at the beginning. I don't want people to get the impression that we're taking food off of people's plate to produce fuels. We take waste products and transform them into fuels, and one of those waste products is what's left over from rendering animals, and so the fats that come from rendering. And years ago, I was reading an article that said that India was the largest exporter of beef, which sort of struck me as odd, and looked into it a little bit more. And it turns out that it's water buffalo, but it's classified as beef in international meat trade. Anyway, in the US, we buy a lot of beef tallow to produce our fuel. And so an interesting project was to figure out how can we go into India, tap into the existing water buffalo tallow market, and bring it to locations that actually have the technology and the capacity to produce renewable fuel out of that. And so, I could walk through all of that, but I just think the subject matter is interesting, and the challenges, the cross-border and the technology challenges are fascinating and totally unexpected.
Who would have expected anybody to mention water buffalo in a renewables conversation? There you have it. Anybody else, any cool stories or projects you want to share?
Yeah, this is cool. But I would say, sometimes you're going to start, this may be part of the kind of broader discussion of, you may do X, Y, and Z that's not directly related to renewables, but you can sort of kind of use that knowledge and implement it on something new you're working on. So a couple of years ago, I started working on a renewable natural gas project. Not project, sorry. But we had a company that was going to acquire 7 renewable natural gas facilities, and they were all based on animal waste. So kind of in line with what Matt was saying. But I think to me, when I was kind of thrown kind of deep into it, and we're doing the diligence and just trying to figure out how all of this works. And I remember we had a lot of kind of like puns and jokes and talking about like being together with other associates and partners, because we have to review like dozens of manure supply agreements, which not something that I've ever looked at before, right? And sort of like, sometimes you sort of have to adjust based on other commercial agreements that you've looked at and start to think, okay, like, what are the, so for example, if I'm buying feedstock, if I'm buying gas from someone or another type of feedstock, it's fairly commercial and straightforward. And you sort of say, okay, if you don't deliver this feedstock that I need to run my facility, then I'll go out and I'll buy it somewhere else, and then you'll owe me cover damages, etc. But as you're kind of building a renewable natural gas facility, you're really like relying on farmers selling you manure, and how do you? So there's such a thing as wet cow equivalent, which talks about basically how much how much manure a dairy cow versus another type of cow can produce. And you start to think, okay, well, what if something happens to the cows? Is this a type of input that you can easily go and buy down the street from someone else? And the answer is no, right? So you sort of like start to think about these risks associated with a project that you're building, kind of like what Jenae was saying. You got to like really step into, you can understand what the client's trying to do, what they're trying to build, kind of step in that and trying to trying to figure out what are the various risks associated with building that project. And so I don't know if there's like a particular single funny story, but I just remember like creating like these large matrices of like many manure supply agreements and thinking about like, what if the cows die? What if the farmers decide to sell their cows? Or like what happened? How do we make sure that, you know, we can continue to produce this renewable natural gas and then as a product sell it to our customers? So that was kind of interesting and something new to figure out.
It might be the most professional conversation on poo that I have ever experienced. Thank you for that, Irina. Jennifer, Jenae, anything else before we kind of wrap up with some final thoughts?
Oh, nothing on
Manure.
based, but anytime you can be, I would just say, you know, as far we were just talking about acquisitions, but anytime you can ever be a part of, you know, some sort of an acquisition, those are always my most favorite because just like, you know, Matt and Irina said, you just, you know, elbow to elbow with your teammates, and there's always very, very, you know, crazy time constraints on it. You're trying to deliver as much information as you can accurately, completely, diligently, and get your client the best deal that you can. But yeah, the long nights, you know, stick with you. But those are some of my favorite, you know, projects to work on because it's always a huge kind of sense of accomplishment, you know, afterwards.
Yeah, I echo that. Some of my most favorite stories are like part war stories and horror stories, but there was like this, you know, great resolution, but it was always like during the crunch time of either you're going through a financing closing or a sale or acquisition and you're under like high deadlines. But I think those are the times that like it really brings like the folks together and really like strengthens those relationships and those late nights. I guess like it's really memorable.
And those late nights will happen, as you all will find out at some point in your career. Enjoy your summers. I will just say that. Cognizant of time, I want to give all the panelists 30 seconds or so to share, you know, a piece of advice they may have for summers. We've all been there before, going forward, or just a, you know, last takeaway. Matt, I'll just start with you at the top.
Oh gosh, a piece of advice. Probably what Jennifer just said. Enjoy your summer, and yeah, work hard, follow a passion, and be an excellent lawyer. If you're looking at renewables, you know, keep in mind that passion will take you a certain distance, but it's important that you know who your client is and you serve them well. And in the renewables, it's a balance between saving the world and providing affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner energy to a changing world.
Jenae, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just say mine's pretty straightforward, but just any time somebody gives you a task to complete, you just want to do it, you know, as perfectly as you can, and then, you know, check it again and make it more perfect. But yeah, you're gonna, you know, do really well for yourself if you put in, you know, the time and effort and care that you would want somebody to show on your project. And people remember who, you know, your partners and your clients are going to remember who went that extra step to make sure that they provided, you know, the best amount of care, because it is a very important thing, you know, to them. So you need to make it important to yourself as well.
Irina?
Yeah, well, echoing everything that everybody else is saying, I think solid advice. Be really good. And sometimes, you know, if you have to do an assignment here and there and you don't necessarily love it, chances are it will just make you a more full, well-rounded attorney. I had to do a bunch of finance work, never been a finance person, don't love it, but it's such a big part of projects world. Now, when I do certain diligence, I at least understand it. I would never like be like the key lead negotiator on it, but sometimes, you know, whatever kind of the assignments come your way, to Matt's point, to Jenae's point, do a really, really good job, ask questions, deliver a good product. And it may just be a building block, like another skill that you sort of add to your purse, of different things that you don't know exactly what you're going to need in the future. So don't shy away from things that aren't necessarily squarely on your radar, like on your path.
And last word goes to Jennifer.
Mine was similar to Irina's about like, don't be afraid to take on those challenges and do the work that like it's uncomfortable to do it because you might not feel like you're the expert, but as an associate and also like for new attorneys, like no one's expecting you to be the expert. Like you're going to make mistakes, like use those as learning opportunities, ask as many questions as you can, and raise your hand for those opportunities that you are interested in, because no one can read your mind. It's really incumbent upon you to take the initiative to go and, knock on those partners' doors or try to get yourself on the projects that you may find interesting.
Awesome. Okay, well, we are 2 minutes over time. That's really good for lawyers. You'll also learn that as you go. I'd like to thank the panelists. I think Ryan might have some closing statements, and thank you all to the Summers who stuck around to listen to us chat for a bit.